insist, they claim that's their case. And people who will go abroad and come back overplay their card. I've had my own fellows that I've trained in Australia come back to India, and I find they're calling themselves fully trained transplant surgeons. They've never done one, because I never let them do one. But they're touting themselves as fully accomplished transplant surgeons. And I said, how many lung retrievals have you done? Oh, I've done 44. Seriously? I know the New Zealand statistics. I can make a phone call and find out. They don't do 44 lung transplants a year. What he was doing is counting both lungs. So he was counting one lung at a time. The whole way is milking the game, the system. It's not always rosier elsewhere, I can tell you. But we do need to change the system. Europe is not all that better. When I was a registrar, junior registrar at King's College for a while, which is where Professor Thapa was also there, briefly, I had a SHO who just joined from Milan. He wanted to be an abdominal transplant surgeon. So he got into one of the most reputable Italian institutions. How did he get there? He applied, he was shortlisted. The day before his exam, in his pigeonhole is an envelope, he opens it and it says, tomorrow, by the way, in your interview, these will be the questions. And he says, serious? Somebody's telling me this? So he goes home and he says, I better mug this up. So he mugs it up, questions come up, he passes with flying colors, gets invited to the professor's room, who welcomes him, said, you're going to be here for the next 4 years, wish you well, welcome on board, and hands him a brand new logbook, surgical logbook. Now the European Union has got a requirement that you have a logbook and that you must have done at least 50 adult cases in that before you're allowed to sit the exit exam. So he goes out, thrilled to bits, chest wide, out, opens it, got his name in it, and he sees signed off cases. So this can't be right. He goes back, knocks on the professor's door, says, I think there's a mistake, Prof. I've just started today, and this log has got my name in with 50 signed cases. He said, yeah, keep it for 4 years so they don't give me a headache after that. Now get on with it, and I'll see you around the hospital. So he then resigned and came as an SHO to the UK, where I bumped into him at King's. The same thing was happening in Germany in falsification of cases. Even in Australia, where I went, I got this very clever, big shot now, a clever young registrar. I said, can I do a bottom end? I said, surely, why are you asking to do just one bottom end, not the whole case? Oh, because if I get to do a bottom end, I can count that as a case. And I was again stunned. In the UK, you did it skin to skin. So there are all ways of, changing the rules. But do you have a logbook? Do you have a structured curriculum? Are you keeping tabs of it? And I'll go through some of that in a moment. So I'm not going to read all this out. These are just basic frameworks and things that are necessary, how we might change things, and how we recognize talent, what do we do to nurture it. But let's just go through some of this, how you build, borrow, and buy talent, infrastructure, whatever it is you need to create expert teams that can deliver. Augmenting HR practices for retention, for example. Role profiling, what's a good practice, what's a bad practice. And the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons is fantastic at doing this. The hurdles you have to go through, the various components of a surgeon that you have to achieve is phenomenal, and that's also true of the Royal College of Surgeons in the UK. How do we reward, recognize talent, and how do we consolidate that going forward? So, investment, ways of retaining, and so on. So let's just go a little bit further. Are there any solutions for then addressing the whole issue of the hemorrhaging talent? Not just surgical, but across the healthcare. So we can try and change that ecosystem, but the principal one, as I remembered, I told you about that little poem of my father's, it's all about nurturing and driving that passion and drive. What about talent being a national resource? And I will touch on that a little later as a part of the solution. But talent itself is, a product of the environment that nurtures some innate or acquired aptitude, allowing that individual to perform that particular task or discipline in a manner way superior to that of the general population. And there's a deep, deep, steep learning curve, depending on the specialty you're in, and that you will, through appropriate training, reach the peak performance through repetition when it becomes reflexive. And you can, to that, add new skills. But then don't forget, there's an inevitable decline. And that's when you should be now delegating and definitely finding somebody to take over your leadership, already having succession planning in place, and not allowing your exit to create a vacuum of worthless choices where nobody has even now got the experience. You're a conductor, you can play all the instruments, you can conduct the music, but when you leave, you've never taught anybody else to do the same thing. You've just relied on everybody being able to play their own little bit of music, but nobody understands how to put that orchestra together. And that's your job, that's my job, is how to delegate that role, how to nurture that role. My job in India, I've said it very openly, my job is to make myself completely obsolete, so that when I leave, hopefully, nobody notices. That would be really nice. And if somebody said, how come things are so much better now that the old bugger's gone, I'll be even happier. Okay? But there are very few people who think that way. And what happens is when talent is not fed and not nurtured, the passion disappears. And I see that all the time amongst trainees, not just here, but sometimes even abroad amongst the trainees that are coming to Australia in this enormous great hope, but for many reasons aren't able to always succeed. And their passion goes, and all they're doing is serving the financial needs to keep alive themselves, their families, and it's a 9-to-5 job and they get a pay. But that passion to drive the discipline, what you grew up with, is gone. The light is extinguished. And that's a very classic example why things are a problem now in cardiovascular and thoracic surgery in the Indian subcontinent, and include Nepal and that, of course. To change the ecosystem, you don't need handouts. Not anymore, certainly. Professor Thapa, I related earlier, how he had to rely on handouts. The kindness through Rotary Club associations, with Alan Gale coming out of Brisbane, the Sydney Adventist Hospital, the Methodist Hospital in Sydney coming out to help, even with Bhawan Koirala. You know, these are the commanders of cardiothoracic surgery in this country. But they had to rely so much on external support. You can do it yourself, individually, because whilst you may blame the central government associated factors that don't make your ecosystem good, at the end of the day, it's you and your trainee across the table or across a patient on whom you're doing some procedure. It doesn't require any change of law. It doesn't require any extra money for you to just say, today I'm going to teach. Because that, inside the confines of that OT, nothing's changed. You are the only person. You as a leaders, consultants in this field, in your subspecialties, have complete control about that ship, that environment. If you don't do it, who's going to do it? And don't forget one thing, and I keep saying this in India, because I'll give you an example of what's happening now in transplantation. Deceased organ donated transplant, typically heart and lung, has to rely on cadaveric deceased organ donation, right? Whether you're in the UK, whether you're in Australia, many other countries, it's a national resource. You cannot do it in the private corporate setup at all. The reason it works in the United States is because they have very good governance in play. There's registries, there's data, there's scrutiny. You do one death, one morbidity, and there'll be 3 people sitting on you the next day trying to figure out what happens. Your hospital gets a negative marking, and it's a big thing. In India, it is so bad, corporate practice, in a country with less than 1 donor per million population, which, I mind you, is sufficient for the current wait list for heart and lungs, but many organs are going in the bin. So, there's an anomalous priority based on date of registration in some states, as there is in Tamil Nadu. So the competitor hospital, who's got a patient registered earlier than mine for the same blood group, has the priority to go and assess the donor, regardless of the data telling you that the donor, although the blood group is matched, is no way the engine size for the heart or the cage size for the lung is ever going to match. He will still go with the team, muck about, assessing, and then what they're doing is making it so that I might say, oh, they've already gone, let's not mount another team at our expense of having to take a flight or ambulance or whatever, but we have to go. So 2 or 3 teams are going with all the expense that the recipient is bearing. For the first team to then, they know they can't do the transplant because it doesn't match. So they say, medically unsuitable. Now there's nothing worse than having that label put on. When I was in Bangalore, I knew they would turn it down in one case. I had my team sit in the car park. I said, you guys just go and sit in the car park. And just as I'd expected, they turned it down on medical grounds. Team goes up, beautiful pair of lungs, the patient is now 2.5 years, doing perfectly well. But it was an enormous risk, because had something happened wrong with that patient, unrelated to the donation side, that team would have come and said, "Arey, we told Dr. Dhital this was medically unsuitable." I'd have been locked up. So this is the practice. So essentially what happens is you prevent another hospital from saving life because that patient is not in your hospital. And so the organ goes in the bucket. That is the competitive nature of medical practice where you have no clinical governance. And for everybody, I'll say it openly to you guys, because I know many of you are in the corporate sector. Deceased cadaveric organ donation in Nepal should never, never, never be in the corporate world. It should be protected in the government, large government public service with support, or a private-public enterprise or something. Because otherwise you'll be doing very little, you will never have the volume, you will therefore be doing risk-free surgery where you will then not operate because you're afraid, it's risky, and patients will die on the wait list. So how do we go about gaining and retaining? We're slowly coming to the end. There are lots of mitigating strategies. I'm again not going to go through all of that, you can scan through it yourselves. But a few years ago I was invited for Christian Barnard's 50th anniversary of first heart transplant. I had to give 2 plenary talks, and my brother-in-law at the time, my niece's father, was the UN ambassador to Zimbabwe. So he said, why don't you come here? So I went there, and he'd already got me lined up to speak to the Zimbabwean Medical Association. That evening, before the day when I was due to give the talk, I met the director of the WHO in Zimbabwe, who said, oh, doctor, I want you to give another talk tomorrow. What should we do with heart disease in Africa? So I stayed up all night looking at facts, figures, and everything, and did another talk. And this is how I'd envisaged the world, and all this brain drain was less on my mind. I realized the world is very much like this, and you're either slipping sideways to Australasia, or you're just draining down to Europe, North America, in terms of surgical pool. So then I realized, and essentially the gist of the talk was that your healthcare professionals are no different than your natural resources of diamond, platinum, gold. Your doctor is worth the same as an ingot of platinum. It has a price, and I'll come to that later. So, what's one solution? Some of you might be Star Wars fan, as my family is. I believe in probably a clone army. Look at the number of healthcare workers going away. You could have this controlled. You could run a system of overproduction that's necessary for yourself and for export. We do that with just about every other commodity. Why not with healthcare workers? You overproduce, you produce your demand. You say, Germany, how many nurses do you need? You need 400 in 5 years? I'll supply them with you. They'll be speaking moderate amount of German as well. They'll be studying your curriculum, your syllabus, and you say the same thing to Italy, Spain, UK, wherever it might be. Why not? Talent has a price. And there has to be a quid pro quo, there has to be a win-win. So for every 100 nurses I send you, I expect you to send me, on your expense, 2 nurse practitioners here teaching our nurses in Kathmandu or elsewhere in Nepal. The other concept is, so during the time of the earthquake, the Ministry of Health reached out while I was in Sydney, see if I could do anything about advising on what can we do about healthcare at the time. So I came, went and toured all the overseas stations. They put up makeshift temporary hospitals. So I then came up with a whole plan to how we could take over. They'd agreed to leave everything behind, and how to decentralize healthcare also. And realized when I visited these places that the surgeon typically, and sometimes the anesthetist, was not even present. The surgeon had shown his face, not always, 3-4 months before and never been seen since. He was in Kathmandu, or she. I realized that the idea of junior doctors being sent out like this to man fields rurally is a crazy system. Because there's no infrastructure, why would a family go? There's nowhere for the kids to go to school and so on. So we have army, the ambulance, the police force, fire brigade. We have to change what we can do rurally. So I've been proposing that what we should have is a new army entirely of nurse practitioners. If you look elsewhere, a well-trained nurse practitioner, whether it be the US, the UK, or elsewhere, actually has quite a lot of skills. They can do minor procedures. They can do simple prescription. They can be the local advocates, where they're coming from that community, where they'll be the advocate of the patient. It can be the station where they can do all the pre-operative, pre-hospital admission workup and generate some local revenue. So it's possible. And these people, if you get them from their local communities, will not leave. Because actually, if you can stay at home with your family and you have that support you would otherwise miss, not everybody wants to go away. Okay. What about this? My son's very much into something called effective altruism. He did medicine for 2 years, qualified, and gave up, saying this is not having enough social impact. He said, you did the right thing to leave Australia, because here, when you go and leave, somebody else will step in your shoes, and now, when you leave, nothing happens. So I'm here for 2 days, and there's no way there's going to happen any transplants for hearts and lungs in the institutes where I work. So you're having an impact. So I've been asking my colleagues abroad about initiating something called 10,000. Remember, 80,000 hours is your career. I'm now last, if I want to work till I'm 70, I've got 10,000 hours left. What am I going to do with it? So I've been asking my colleagues abroad, would you, before or after retirement, consider, at the peak of your career, at the peak of your ability to train on the shop floor, standing on the left side, would you come to a place like Nepal or India and spend 2 months or 2 years? Unanimously, yes from everybody. Particularly, in fact, if they work in the corporate sector, they can also get a salary, probably, to be fair, in the corporate sector in this continent, is not much different from the salary in Europe, certainly UK. So you can incentivize all sorts of ways of bringing talent in to change the ecosystem, because if people can see that you can change the ecosystem, they'll say, do I really need to go away? This is pretty good training. That guy was training my seniors, and now he's here training me. But will you let people who recognize as being the figures, leaders in their field outside, come here and teach? My experience has been the typical Nepali thing that if somebody is not local, they know a little bit more about you, is to close the door completely. The idea of having somebody who knows a little bit more about you is anathema to most people I've met. I told you I was going to be critical. That's the reality. So coming to the end now, how do you create an innovative climate? Well, again, those these ideas, competent and passionate workforce. You need the infrastructure, you need funding. And this is important because we can't just rely on remittance as a solution for these countries' needs, including healthcare. We have to start generating medical devices, solutions, drug discovery, with the mountain full of amazing plants and science that we have behind us that we should be doing to drive the nation's growth here. If a little tiny postage stamp of Israel can become the world's hub of biomedical engineering and export, there's no reason why you can't do that here. So how do you create a surgical training ecosystem? And I'll only give you the example while you look at that in the UK. There is a mandated 6-monthly meeting of a review board at the level of the regional training committee, consisting of you, an advocate trainee, as well as a witness, the consultants, where you can be as frank as you like about what you got taught or not taught with no repercussion. It is completely risk-free. In fact, if you're not teaching or training, you're likely to be taking your fellow away from you. That means the hospital no longer getting the salary for your junior staff. It'll get moved. You will be cancelled as a trainer. And vice versa. There's also cap and stick for the trainee. So, coming towards the end, Professor Thapa really was, as I said, the father of cardiac surgery here, performing the first open heart cases and driving the next generation, including the initial nurturing and springboarding off the current, I would say, although he's not just only retired, Bhagwan Koirala and his team. And I spend my time at Guy's in St. Thomas's as a trainee in the UK, but spent 6 months at King's. And Guy's, how it was and how it was in the past, and when I was there, Dorcas Ward, that Dr. Thapa will probably remember. So to the trainees, I say there is no substitute for hard work. There's no free lunch. You should be not just honing your skills in surgery, you should be honing your skills in statistics so you can go and write the paper. This is where the Indian trainees are way superior. My Indian fellows, for example, in the UK, I would come up with an idea and the next morning on my desk I would find a full abstract with a complete summary of the online database with an idea of how we might proceed with the next research piece. Because the Indian guy, we have to learn to become Indians because I see this competitive nature to survive, to do better from the day they're born. We are a little, I think, even from my childhood living here, we're a little lazier. Maybe it's good, because if it's enough, why do you want more? My wife always says, if you're eating, I tend to be a bit of a glutton. She says, why eat more than if it's enough? If enough is as good as a feast. So what about the trainers? It's your job to be the catalyst for change. And you can only do that because you're the leader in that ship. You need to facilitate mentorship, not just teaching and innovation. And not everybody can teach and mentor, but between the group that you can have some people who's doing the public work, some doing the private, some doing the lecturing, some doing the research. You have to respect each one of those. You've got to start welcoming questions. I find in India it's just, yes, sir. I went there, everybody's saying yes, sir. And everybody's standing up every time I go down the corridor. And I said, you've got to stop this. And I realized what the yes, sir meant. The yes, sir meant everything is on your head. We will do whatever you tell us to do, but don't expect anything else, and everything is on your head. Right? That's what the yes, sir is. So you need to foster a teamwork. Stop being the megalomaniac that you don't know everything. Sometimes your junior registrar comes up with a brilliant idea, they've just read the latest, and be open to that. Be open to questions. Medical students from Asia and Australia would hardly ever ask a question at the ward round. I'd have to tell them, guys, I want you to open up, speak, because they weren't taught that way. They were taught, I'm teaching you, this is what it is, forget everything else, regardless of whether it's true or false. So, in India they refer to docs as God or Godse. Well, many places think of doctors as gods. I hope you don't. I hope what you're just wanting is a bit of respect. And not to end up being referred to as Godse, because that's when you get the violence and the criticism. So, things don't always look good above the surface, but you, most of you here as mentors, can change that. So be the change. Thank you for your attention.